This happened when I was very young. Since this is technically still an active investigation, I will omit certain details from the story. For some context, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming. As a non-outdoorsy kind of guy, growing up in the cowboy state wasn't exactly exciting on any level. As a side note, I didn't really appreciate my home state when I was younger. When I was going through my rebellious stage, I moved to Chicago and went to school there for 3 years. After I finished my education, I moved to San Francisco, where I resided until 2016. By then, I had my fill of city life, and I hightailed it back to Wyoming. I now live in Cheyenne. In my hometown, there was virtually no crime in my area whatsoever. It was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked at night. The only thing that we kids had to contend with was boredom. However, there was one incident that shook the entire community, one that I happened to witness firsthand. The year was 1991. I was in elementary school at the time. Back then, the school that I went to was located between several small coal mining towns that didn't have schools of their own. Some of these communities were an hour away, and for whatever reason, the school didn't provide bus rides to students who lived in these remote areas. My mom didn't get off of work until 4, and it took her about 45 minutes to come pick me up from school. There was a playground located in the schoolyard, where students who were being picked up by their parents would hang out, unsupervised. On the day in question, me and another kid named Thomas were the only ones on the playground. When class let out that day, I noticed that there was an old pickup truck sitting in the parking lot, ominously facing the playground. I thought nothing of it at the time. I didn't know Thomas very well, and we didn't really talk to each other. I remember that I was trying to do chin-ups on the monkey bars, while he was sitting on the bench near the parking lot. I eventually got bored of the monkey bars and walked over to sit on the slide so I could get out of the sun for a while. Shortly after, I overheard Thomas talking to someone. No, I don't know you, and I'm not going with you." I was facing the opposite direction. The main playground area sat between the slide and the bench Thomas was sitting on. But when I looked over, I did make out a figure standing next to Thomas. The only thing I seem to recall about them is that they were wearing a pair of jeans. My memory gets a little fuzzy after this, which is disappointing because I pride myself on having a pretty good memory. The only thing I remember after noticing the mysterious person talking to Thomas was seeing the truck speeding out of the parking lot and then realizing that Thomas was gone. I didn't see Thomas getting into the truck. I didn't even realize that Thomas had been kidnapped until the day after. My mom arrived about 10 minutes later. The next day I was called into the principal's office and was asked by a police officer if I had seen Thomas the day before. I told him about the strange truck in the parking lot and seeing someone talking to him while I was on the slide. Unfortunately, the story does not have a happy ending. Thomas's body was found in a ditch a week later in the neighboring state of North Dakota, which is less than an hour away from the school. This tragedy shook the entire community. A lot of parents blame the school for not having someone out there watching us, which is a perfectly valid point in my opinion. After what happened to Thomas, not only did they have a chaperone out there watching us, but a police car was also stationed in the parking lot. It wasn't until I got older that I realized just how lucky I was not to be taken that day. I potentially came very close to meeting the same fate as Thomas. The scariest part of all this is that they were never able to find who abducted him or what their motive was. It just happened out of nowhere for seemingly no reason whatsoever. It's a scary thought to imagine someone just waking up one day and deciding to kidnap and murder an innocent child right out of the schoolyard. I don't think living in constant fear is healthy. However, be aware that evil lurks everywhere, even in some of the most remote, unassuming places.
This is a true story that involves my firstborn son. He was in second grade at the time, and we were living in Tacoma, Washington. It's been 27 years since this occurred, but it still haunts me to this day. A little backstory to put these events into perspective. It was January of 1995. It was a traumatic month for our family. My son, up to this point, had been walking to and from his bus stop, which was a block and a half away from our house, located at the bottom of a steep hill. He'd have to walk down in on the mornings and up in the afternoons. There was an elderly man from Korea who lived across the street from us, who had been brutally murdered, which is an unrelated incident. But needless to say, tensions were high in our neighborhood around the time. We lived in a small complex with 4 houses, each one with its own fenced-in yard. There was an entry gate that enclosed everything. My son used to take a shortcut through the alleyway that ran behind the houses to get to his bus stop. He had done it so many times that it had become normal, and there was not a worry in the world as to our son's safety until the day in question. That day started like any other. I woke at around 6 to get the kids ready for school. Our eldest son was the first one to leave. He was in special ed and had to be bused across the city. Then our eldest son left the house. I watched him as he walked through the complex, then out the gate, and disappeared down the alleyway. Fast forward to the afternoon. I knew that my eldest son would be coming home from school soon. I was busy in the house, tending to chores, when I heard a frantic knocking at my door. I opened it and saw through the screen door that it was my next-door neighbor, and she had a terrified look on her face. "Hey, what's wrong?" She then told me she saw someone trying to lure my son into their car. I immediately screamed for my husband, and we both ran out of the house. To our horror, there was someone in a white sedan reaching through the driver's side window of the car, pulling my son by his shirt. If you aren't a parent, you can't imagine how terrifying this was to witness. I went ballistic while my husband ran towards the car screaming,
"Hey, get the hell away from my son!"
Our son managed to pull away from the driver and quickly backed against the perimeter fence. I saw that every time he went to move, the vehicle kept moving to prevent him from escaping. At this point, the neighbors that had lived across the alley heard all the commotion, and they leaped over their fence and sprinted to the front of the sedan. And the others swept our son into his arms and quickly brought him over to us. The assailant just sat in his car, stone silent, not moving at all. I remember staring into his soulless eyes. I had never seen so much emptiness in my life. It sent shivers down my back. It was like I was looking into the very eyes of the devil himself. The driver actually sat there long enough that we were able to get a complete physical description of him, the vehicle, and his license plate information. My next-door neighbor called the police, but of course by the time they got there, the man had already left the scene. It still freaks me out to think about what would have happened to our son if my next-door neighbor hadn't seen what she saw that day. We might have never seen our son again. Another thing that upsets me is right before the man took off, he pulled out a Polaroid camera and took a couple of my son. That really got under my skin. When a police officer finally came, he looked like he was fresh out of high school. I remember him eyeing me skeptically and said I was just being a hysterical mom. Like, what the fuck? Is that what you tell someone who just saw their son almost get kidnapped? My advice to all police is that they don't send a rookie out to investigate a child abduction case, and also don't hire fucking morons. This incident has scarred me for life. I wouldn't let our son out of my sight and made him hold my hand everywhere we went. I went to extremes to protect my other children as well. So if you think that nothing bad can ever happen to you, please think again and take caution with your children. To end things on a happy note, my son is now 35 years old. happily married and is a successful auto mechanic with his own shop. It is a dangerous world out there. God bless you all and stay safe.
When I was a kid, my family would often frequent this Italian restaurant near the city's airport called Martino's. My great-uncle discovered this place during his quest to find a genuine Chicago-style hot dog outside of the Windy City. On the day in question, I went to Martino's with my dad and my uncle for lunch. I believe this was in the middle of my school's summer break, and my mom opted to stay home that day for whatever reason. After we were done, the three of us soon returned to my dad's car. My uncle got in the passenger seat and I climbed into the back. We hadn't gotten very far from the restaurant when we noticed an older pickup truck tailing us, driving very erratically. The truck kept accelerating, pulling right up to our rear bumper and then backing off, only to do it over again. Evidently, they were in a big hurry, trying to get my dad to go faster or to move out of their way. My old man isn't the type of guy who takes shit from anybody, except my mom. So he kept driving at the speed limit, refusing to move over. I thought the truck would eventually pass us. Instead, it got right on our bumper and stayed there. From the back seat, I couldn't quite see into the rearview mirror, but I remember my dad saying that the driver was so angry that he was banging on his steering wheel and screaming at us. The truck stayed behind us until we came to the next stoplight, which of course was red. As soon as we came to a stop, the driver's side door of the pickup truck flew open and a younger guy stepped out. He was maybe in his late 20s to early 30s. My dad put his car into park and opened his door. Before the guy could even get a word out, my dad said very calmly, "You need to get back in your truck." For a second, the guy seemed taken off guard and looked as though he was about to back down. But then he took a step forward, staring my dad in the eyes. My uncle and I were both preparing for the worst when the stoplight suddenly flicked back to green. The guy sprinted back to his truck and tore off down the road. If my dad had been shaken, he didn't show it. My uncle and I were definitely on edge from the encounter, but we took comfort in knowing that we wouldn't see that truck again. Or so we thought. It was quite a ways up the road until we reached another intersection. We were in the right lane, and the truck was in the far left turn lane. Upon seeing it, my dad burst into laughter and made a wisecrack.
He was in a big hurry to go nowhere.
Hey, watch this. As we came to a stop, my dad rolled down his window.
Hey, jackass!
When the driver looked towards us, my dad did a perfect imitation of him, banging on the steering wheel and shouting incoherently, the whole bit. That's when the driver lost his shit. The pickup truck backed up and came tearing out of the turn lane, barreling straight across the road, directly at us. My dad quickly turned down the intersecting road, the truck following behind, tailgating us again as my dad pushed the car to its limits. We were hauling ass, but the truck was quickly closing in. Just up the road, there was an interstate ramp. My dad made a ballsy move. He waited until the very last second, and then quickly skidded our car into the ramp lane. As we climbed up the ramp, the last thing we heard was the truck's horn blaring as it disappeared out of sight. Thankfully, after that, we made it back home safely. When my mom saw how freaked out my uncle and I were, she pressured my dad into telling the story. I'm pretty certain she chewed him out right after, especially for his imitation gag. But as was typical, my dad was pleased with himself. We still talk about what happened that day every now and again, and we used to laugh about it, but now, even my dad doesn't crack jokes about it anymore. I think he finally understands just how deranged that man was and the potential danger we were in. At any moment, things could have turned deadly.